Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door NetAdmin. Today, I'm going to start talking a little bit about Active Directory. This is in response to a request that I had in the comments section from the Ani guy, and he said, can you maybe talk a little bit about Active Directory? I can absolutely do that. Fun fact, though, when I started work as a network engineer all the way back in 2009, I didn't know all that much about Active Directory. In fact, I'd never even used the thing. So everything I know about Active Directory is what I've learned basically on the job, through working with it, through figuring out how to make it do the things that I need it to do. I had lots of previous experience in networking, just networking. Active Directory came later as part of system administration. Active Directory itself is based on quite a few component technologies, but there's three that are particularly key. One of which is DNS. I've talked about DNS lots. One is Kerberos, and I talked about that one more recently in the pair of videos that I did about single sign-on technologies. And the third component, which is really Active Directory's core, if I can call it that, is actually based on something called LDAP. And that is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So if we're talking about accessing a directory, it would be nice to know, what is this directory? Well, I'm going to go even further back in time for a second and say, for those of you who remember having a phone book, the old yellow pages, some of you may remember that back in the days of phone books where you would, look things up in the phone book, you would occasionally have a local number that you could call for directory assistance. And you could call the operator and they would help you look it up if you didn't have the phone book with you or handy or something. And they would look through the directory to find the number that you wanted to call, and then they could connect you. That is kind of what a directory is in that sense. Less a phone book in terms of where do I find people. That is something that is more a function of DNS in translating names to numeric addresses. But the directory has a whole bunch of information in there. And you can think of this as, for example, an entry in the yellow pages, specifically when you're looking at businesses. Very common for businesses to have, a little advert there. It has their phone number, it has their business name, yes, but it also has maybe things like their hours. It might have their address. It might have what are some of the services that they are providing. It might have, hey, we've got a special deal on this year or this month or whatever. And all of that is indexed under a category within, and then it'll be indexed by their name, usually in alphabetical order. And so you've got a general structure of organization, and then you've got an entity, and then you've got a bunch of details associated with that entity. That is the structure that we're thinking about when we're talking about a directory. It's organized hierarchically in categories often, but the benefit of the directory is you can organize it however you want. And then you have a series of entities. Typically in Active Directory itself, these might be computers, these might be users, these might be services, these might be groups, whether security groups or distribution groups or what have you. And these entities will all have a series of values associated with them. It might be first name, last name, email address, phone number, manager, office, other parameters such as office address, office phone number. There's a lot of parameters that can be filled out that we often don't see filled out, honestly, in Active Directory, but the capability is there. The directory is set up to accept that kind of information. So, LDAP then, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is how you talk to the directory in order to access the information. Why you want to access that information, that's up to you. But that's how we have these parameters stored in the network to form an authoritative source of this is this entity, here's the information associated with it. Here's this entity, here's the information associated with it. Here's this computer, it has this operating system, this version of the operating system, this level of hotfix. It's at this location in the network as a host name. It's got this security information associated with it, the machine account password, essentially. Here's a user. Here's the information associated with the user. This directory is then the authoritative source of information for everybody's identities within the domain, as far as the domain's concerned. Now, if you remember from Kerberos, passwords are not actually transmitted across the network. And Kerberos is the protocol that actually is able to validate that. If Active Directory, if the directory component itself has the information on here is the user and this is a password associated with the user, Kerberos is what then steps in and says, okay, so I can use this recorded authoritative value of password in order to hash it, encrypt my ticket granting ticket, and send that off to the user. And if they've entered the correct if they've entered the correct password on their end, then they can decrypt the ticket granting ticket and single sign-on kicks in and you're off to the races. DNS is the other essential component of Active Directory, because this is how all the machines find each other. There is an entry in Active Directory that says, hey, if you're looking to use LDAP, if you're looking to use Kerberos, here's the address and the port number where it is available. Incredibly key to have DNS integrated with Active Directory, because that's how it works. That's just how it works. So these technologies have all been around for quite some time. Active Directory was developed back in 1999, and it was first released as part of Windows 2000. Now, that's not when domains started. Domains were available back in NT4. Windows NT4 server and Windows NT Workstation, their domains were a little different. The structure was different. In NT4, you had a designated primary domain controller and a backup domain controller, and everything has to go through the primary domain controller first, because that's the authoritative source. Okay. When Active Directory came out in Windows Server 2000, or Windows 2000 Server, I don't remember which way around that is. By design, Active Directory actually uses what's called a multi-master replication layout. Each server is actually a peer with the other servers. There is no primary and backup distinction. They're all peers. But there is a flexible service master operator. Service master operator, I think. Yeah. Flexible service master operator, FSMO or FISMO. And there's a role for primary domain controller emulator. One of the domain controllers in an Active Directory domain is chosen to emulate the role of a primary domain controller. for legacy purposes. And the primary domain controller emulator is still where any password changes are sent first. And then from the PDC emulator, it can go through the rest of the network. But the directory itself is peer-to-peer. And the directory also has the DNS zones that support the domain. And that is also a peer-to-peer relationship. It replicates between all the domain controllers without there being a primary, secondary, tertiary, etc. So while the concept of a domain started in NT4, this particular construct of Active Directory and this blend of technologies came about in the release of Windows 2000, having been developed in 1999, which means that all of these technologies actually have a good bit of life behind them. LDAP is something that was already out in 1999, LDAP version 2. Probably LDAP version 3, although I don't remember precisely when version 3 came out. Active Directory is based on LDAP versions 2 and 3. So it's been out there for a while. And every now and then you can see this lineage because some things that you want to do in Active Directory require you to speak LDAP. And if you're doing more advanced things, for example, there's a tool called ADSI Edit, which allows you to directly manipulate the information in the directory, not through the standard GUI, which has some precautions in there, but actually manipulating the data objects themselves. It's kind of dangerous to use that tool because there's not much in the way of safeguards there. You can easily nuke a domain by deleting the wrong object in ADSI Edit. But when you're in ADSI Edit, you are looking at essentially an LDAP-based server. You're looking at the directory itself. There's different naming contexts that you can log on to. You can fetch the different objects and update their values. And for more advanced things like searches or for hunting through the directory for a particular value, which I suppose is another type of search. Good for me, I just described the same thing 2 different ways. But you have to be able to speak LDAP. There are some things like, for example, if I want to connect to a domain controller and I want to search for a bunch of accounts that all have a roaming profile that is stored on a particular server. Okay, well, in Windows and in Active Directory users and computers, you just have // server name, off you go. Okay. If you try searching for that using the PowerShell commands for Active Directory, you won't get anything because you're not actually speaking PowerShell to Active Directory. You have to send this in LDAP syntax, which means in order to encode an actual literal /, you need to use a / as an escape character and then use the hexadecimal code for a /. So instead of // server name, you end up putting in /5c /5c server name. That's one of those silly little gotchas that can trip you up quite a bit and go, why do I have to do this? I don't have to do this in literally anything else. It's because you're speaking LDAP to the server directly. And this is built on something that is over 20 years old now. So there's lots of reference documentation out there if you want to go figure it out. But first you got to know that this is what it's actually based on. Active Directory itself is at its core just those 3 things. But then Microsoft has layered a lot of other things on it, and Active Directory as a brand name has been extended to cover a bunch of other things. There was a service called Certificate Services. These days it's called Active Directory Certificate Services. Is it based on LDAP? No, not especially, but it's layered on top of Active Directory to leverage this central store of identities, and then it can lean on Kerberos, it can lean on DNS to help the communication actually work. You can have Active Directory federation services. That's something else that's been layered on top of it. If you want, you can have Active Directory lightweight directory services. It used to be called Active Directory Application Mode, or ATOM. And that's a separate thing all on its own. You can have group policies. That's a separate thing that's been layered on top of Active Directory as well. There are all of these services. Microsoft Exchange, there's another one that you can install it into a domain, and it will actually extend the directory schema and say, okay, you used to have all of these attributes for user accounts, but now I need to keep track of a bunch of other things specifically for Exchange. So you actually have to extend the schema and say all of your user accounts are now going to include a bunch of these other attributes as well. And everything has to be upgraded in the domain to support that. It's part of why Exchange installations and upgrades are so invasive in a domain, is because you have to actually extend the domain's parameters to be able to handle Exchange. But that gets layered in on top of Active Directory. And so there are a lot of different things that we can talk about in Active Directory, piece by piece. Not all at once, just piece by piece. So that's the background to Active Directory, and that should give us a little more of a base that we can stand on when we talk about this in future weeks. Things I'm planning on talking about do include the basics of how Active Directory is typically organized. Again, you can set this up to do whatever you want, but typical organization, okay. Group policies, that's another thing for us to talk about, absolutely. Active Directory certificate services, often a bit of a nightmare, but I can talk about that too. Active Directory federated services or federation services, I can also talk a little bit about that. I know what it's for, and I know the general gist of how it works. I've never actually had to configure it, fortunately for me. So I can't be as specific about the things that you can do or the things that you can see, but I know the theory because I've had to study it, and I've had at least one instance where I thought I was going to have to implement it and started making preparations for it, and then the need went away, so I never actually had to put that into practice. But we can talk about all of these things. It'll just take us a little bit of time, piece by piece, just to make sure that we're not completely overwhelmed. And also to make sure that this doesn't become a 2-hour video, because it easily could, because I talk a lot, as you all know. So, but that's where I'm going to end it for today. So we have a little bit of a background. We have an idea of where we're going. Cool. Big thanks to the Ana guy for the suggestion on something to talk about that you were interested in hearing. Honestly, I could have talked about Active Directory a long time ago, but I was like, I don't know, maybe my audience isn't interested. Maybe that's too basic for them. I don't know. So glad to hear that this is something that people do want to hear, and I can easily talk about it. If you have thoughts on other things that you'd like me to talk about in future, or things that you'd like to see me demonstrate, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.